The snow fell relentlessly, blanketing the world in a deadly silence. But inside that abandoned cabin, K9 Shadow's low growl was an alarm, cutting through the frigid air. His elite nose pointed towards the fireplace, towards a secret the FBI would never expect, the silent cry of a homeless girl. K9 Shadow's low growl, which moments before had cut through the frigid air of the abandoned cabin, transformed into a silent alarm in Ethan Thorne's chest. The snow fell relentlessly outside, but inside the newly revealed compartment, the temperature seemed to plummet even further. Ethan knelt, the concentrated beam of his flashlight cutting through the damp, claustrophobic darkness. The smell of wet earth and mold was suffocating, mixed with a subtle odor, almost undetectable to human senses, but unmistakable to Shadow, the smell of a child. His eyes scanned the small space, barely larger than a big box. On the packed dirt floor, on a faded and dirty pink blanket, lay the undeniable traces of a child's presence. A battered teddy bear with one eye torn out seemed to stare into the void. Beside it, a crayon drawing, crumpled and faded, depicted a stick-figure family under a smiling sun. The sight tightened Ethan's stomach, an icy knot of revulsion and urgency. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a cage. Shadow, still with his fur bristling, sniffed the air eagerly, a low whimper escaping his throat. His agitation indicated that the trail was fresh. The victim had left very recently. "She was here, boy. She was here very recently," Ethan murmured, his voice hoarse, more to himself than to the dog. Pulling the satellite radio from his belt, Ethan fought against the storm's interference. The device crackled, but the connection was established. "Dispatch, this is Thorne. Repeat, this is Thorne. We have a federal crime scene. Minor in captivity confirmed. Urgent. I need search teams, forensics, and a command unit here now. The victim may still be in the vicinity." His voice was a command, loaded with a gravity he rarely used. The minutes that followed dragged on, each second a hammer pounding in Ethan's temple. The wind howled furiously through the cabin's cracks, making the structure creak and snow whip against the windows. Shadow remained vigilant, his gaze fixed on the compartment's opening, as if expecting the girl to emerge at any moment. Then a distant sound broke the blizzard's silence, the rumble of snowmobile engines, followed by the crunch of boots on compacted snow. The cabin door opened with a thud, and a blast of frigid air invaded the space, bringing with it a team of FBI agents. The cabin, once a desolate refuge, transformed into an operations center. Portable lights illuminated every corner, and the murmur of voices filled the air. Dr. Anya Sharma, head of the forensics team, a woman with piercing eyes and precise movements, approached Ethan wearing a sterile white jumpsuit. The click of digital cameras echoed as her team began to document the scene. "Agent Thorne," she said, her voice calm and professional. "The traces are fresh, very fresh. By the characteristics of the organic material and the absence of degradation, I'd say she was here a few hours ago, perhaps less. The kidnapper shouldn't be far." Anya's confirmation ignited a cold flame of determination in Ethan. Time was crucial. The girl was out there, somewhere in the vast, unforgiving white expanse of the mountains, at the mercy of the elements and her captor. He looked at Shadow, who was now sitting beside the compartment, observing the commotion with an intensity only he possessed. "We'll find her, boy," Ethan whispered, the promise weighing in his chest, a silent oath. The meticulousness of the hiding place, the remote location, the evidence of a homeless child, all of it pointed to something far larger than an isolated kidnapping. The criminal network mentioned in the intelligence was revealing itself, weaving its threads in the shadows. The search for the girl was now the tip of a dark iceberg, and Ethan knew this was just the beginning of a desperate hunt. The cabin, once an abandoned refuge, now buzzed with the contained energy of a federal operation. The hum of portable generators and the click of forensic cameras filled the air, muffling the incessant howl of the wind outside. Agents moved with purpose, their heavy footsteps on the creaking wood, their voices low and urgent. Ethan Thorne watched the scene, the knot in his stomach tightening with each passing second. The desperate search for the girl was the epicenter, but the spiderweb that was beginning to unravel seemed to extend far beyond those walls. Dr. Sharma emerged from the hidden compartment, her face serious under the protective hood. She held a small evidence bag with tweezers. "Agent Thorne!" she called, her voice calm but laden with silent gravity. "We found more than we expected. Besides the obvious traces of the child, there are unusual synthetic fibers clinging to the blankets. They're not common in street clothes or household blankets. They seem to come from a specific type of industrial equipment or possibly protective clothing." Ethan frowned. "Industrial equipment? That doesn't fit the profile of a common kidnapper." "Exactly," Anya confirmed. "And there are also traces of a mild sedative on the toys. Enough to calm, but not to fully incapacitate. It suggests the captor wanted cooperation, not a struggle, or at least to keep the victim docile without raising suspicions of immediate physical abuse." The click of a camera echoed as she handed the bag to an assistant. "We're processing everything now. This might give us an idea of the suspect's profile or the environment they came from." Outside, the blizzard showed no mercy. The world was a white and grey blur, the biting wind whipping snow into whirlwinds. Search teams, equipped with snowmobiles and tracking dogs, prepared to brave the fury of the elements. Shadow, however, didn't wait for orders. His amber eyes fixed on the fresh snow around the cabin, he began to sniff with renewed intensity. A low growl, almost a whimper, escaped his throat, and he moved, tugging lightly on the leash Ethan held. "What is it, boy?" Ethan murmured, sensing the dog's urgency. Shadow didn't stop, following a trail invisible to human eyes, but crystal clear to his supernatural nose. He circled the cabin, ignoring the agent's footprints, and stopped abruptly near a cluster of snow-laden pine trees. His fur bristled again, and he scratched the snow with his paw, a muffled bark escaping. Ethan knelt, sweeping the area with his flashlight. Snow covered everything, but right there under the most recent layer was a mark. It wasn't a clear human footprint, but a deeper depression, as if something heavy had been dragged, and the smell, the subtle scent of something metallic and oily mixed with the girl's scent, hung in the air. "Dispatch, this is Thorne. Shadow found a trail. It looks like something was dragged from here, heading northwest, beyond the tree line." Ethan shouted into the radio, his voice almost swallowed by the wind. "It's a fresh trail, very fresh. The victim may have been taken in some kind of vehicle or sled." The operations chief, Agent Miller, a veteran with scars from countless missions, approached, his face hardened by concern. "Northwest is dangerous terrain, Thorne. Canyons, abandoned hunting trails. The storm is worsening, but if Shadow has a trail—" "He does," Ethan stated with conviction. "And the girl wouldn't last long out there. We need to go now." The decision was made. The rumble of snowmobiles intensified, and powerful lights cut through the growing darkness of the blizzard. Ethan tightened Shadow's leash, feeling the dog's body heat against his leg. The hunt had truly begun, and every falling snowflake was a reminder of the dwindling time. The synthetic fibers, the sedative, the drag marks, pieces of a dark puzzle that fit into a disturbing picture, revealing the cold efficiency of an organization operating in the shadows. And the girl was just a pawn in their cruel game. The roar of snowmobiles tore through the relentless shriek of the blizzard. Ethan Thorne, mounted on his powerful machine, felt the biting wind lash his face, stinging his exposed skin despite layers of gear. Shadow, securely harnessed to a specialized sled behind Ethan, strained forward, his powerful paws churning through the deep snow, his nose glued to the faint trail. The amber lights mounted on the snowmobiles cut through the white, turbulent chaos, painting fleeting patterns on the endless expanse of snow and the skeletal branches of the pine trees. Agent Miller, leading the second snowmobile, pulled alongside Ethan for a moment. "The storm's getting worse, Thorne. Visibility almost zero. If it weren't for your K9... His voice was almost swallowed by the wind's howl. "He's got a trail!" Ethan shouted back, determination hardening his voice. "We're not stopping." Shadow's low growl, a constant vibration through the sled rope, confirmed his conviction. The dog was relentless, his supernatural nose cutting through the metallic smell of the snowmobile's exhaust and the overwhelming aroma of the storm. He pulled them northwest, exactly as Ethan had reported, into treacherous terrain of steep inclines and narrow passes, where snow piled in dangerous drifts. The industrial fibers and traces of sedative found by Dr. Sharma echoed in Ethan's mind. This was not a desperate act by a lone wolf. This was calculated, methodical. The drag marks Shadow had found suggested a heavy load, carefully concealed, a sled, perhaps, or a custom-made container. The thought sent a chill, far colder than the mountain air, through Ethan's veins. Someone had planned this, meticulously. Hours turned into an exhausting test of endurance. The snowmobiles struggled up a particularly steep ridge, their engines groaning under the strain. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at their clothes, and snow fell so thick it felt like they were driving through a solid white wall. Ethan squinted, trying to discern anything beyond the faint trail Shadow followed. Suddenly, Shadow let out a sharp, urgent bark, pulling harder on his harness. He veered sharply to the right, towards a cluster of old snow-laden fir trees that offered a precarious shield against the wind. Ethan braked hard, the snowmobile skidding to a halt. Miller and his team stopped behind him, their engines idling, casting an eerie glow on the scene. "What is it, boy?" Ethan asked, his voice tense. Shadow ignored him, digging furiously into a snowdrift near the base of the largest fir. His paws churned, sending plumes of white powder into the air, revealing a dark, rigid object underneath. Ethan dismounted, his boots sinking deep into the snow. He knelt beside Shadow, brushing away the remaining snow. What he uncovered made his breath catch in his throat. It was a small, crudely carved wooden bird, painted in faded blues and yellows, with broken wings. It lay nestled next to a patch of disturbed earth, where the snow had recently been cleared and then covered again. "It's hers," Ethan murmured, a shiver running down his spine. He recognized the style. It was very similar to the stick-figure drawings found in the cabin. The girl must have dropped it, or perhaps with a thread of hope had left it there on purpose, a sign. But Shadow wasn't finished. He sniffed the wooden bird, then the disturbed earth, his nose twitching. He whimpered, a low, mournful sound, and then began to dig again, with renewed urgency a few feet away. This time, he unearthed something metallic. Ethan reached out, pulling a small, rectangular device, no larger than the palm of his hand. It was cold to the touch, its surface scratched and covered in frozen mud. A small red light blinked rhythmically on its side. "What is that?" Miller asked, his voice grave, approaching. Ethan looked at the device, a sudden, chilling realization dawning on him. It's a GPS tracker, industrial by the looks of it, and it's active. A wave of shock went through the team. The captor not only used industrial equipment, but was also tracking himself, or perhaps something he had left behind. The girl was not just a victim. She was part of a much more complex operation. The drag marks, the synthetic fibers, the sedative, the tracker, it all fit the picture of a cold, calculating organization. And they had just found a vital piece of the puzzle, pointing to an as-yet unknown destination deep within that unforgiving mountain. Ethan held the small device, its red light pulsing a silent, urgent signal in the turbulent snow. "A GPS tracker," he repeated, his voice hoarse, the wind trying to snatch it from his lips. "It's active. Where is it leading us?" Agent Miller knelt beside him, removing a glove to handle the object carefully. "It's a militarized model, Thorne, not something you buy at an electronics store." This confirms what Dr. Sharma said about the industrial equipment. Agent Chen from the communications team was already on the radio, his gloved hands working quickly on a rugged tablet. "Dispatch, this is Chen. We have a tracker ID code. Stand by. Looks like a long-range transponder designed for extreme environments. I'll try to triangulate it." The air crackled with static as Chen struggled to get a clear signal amidst the blizzard's interference. The tablet glowed, and a faint green line appeared on the topographic map, extending north, deeper into the mountains. "Got it," Chen exclaimed, his voice filled with relief. "The signal is strong. It points to an area about 10 kilometers from here, an old mining complex, abandoned for decades, known as Crow's Throat Complex." The news reverberated among the team, an abandoned mining complex. This fit perfectly with the idea of an organization operating in the shadows, using isolated and forgotten locations for their obscure purposes. "Crow's Throat Complex," Miller hissed, his face hardened. "I know that area. It's a labyrinth of tunnels and galleries, dangerous even in summer. With this blizzard—" "It's our destination," Ethan interrupted, already mounting his snowmobile. "Shadow, let's go." The dog, sensing the shift in urgency, let out a sharp bark and positioned himself, ready to continue. The snowmobile engines roared again, cutting through the incessant howl of the wind. The landscape transformed, trees becoming denser, slopes steeper and rockier. The snow, driven by the wind, lashed their faces like thousands of ice needles. Visibility was almost zero, and Ethan relied entirely on his vehicle's lights and Shadow's infallible instinct. The GPS tracker provided a clear direction, but Shadow continued to sniff the ground, his amber eyes fixed on the snow. He didn't just trust technology, he felt the presence. The faint, persistent scent of the girl, now mixed with a new aroma, something electrical, metallic, and somewhat industrial. They pressed on for another hour, battling the seemingly endless storm. The terrain became treacherous, with exposed rocks and hidden crevices under the snow. Suddenly, Shadow stopped abruptly, his fur bristling, a deep growl emerging from his throat. He was no longer following a trail, he was reacting to something immediate. "What is it, boy?" Ethan asked, braking sharply. Shadow ignored him, moving to the edge of a snow-covered precipice, his barks now more urgent, almost a warning. Ethan approached cautiously, his flashlight sweeping the darkness. A few feet from the edge, the snow seemed less natural, more compacted. He knelt, brushing away the superficial layer. Beneath, there was no earth or rock, but a smooth, grey surface. "Miller, come here," Ethan called, his voice tense. Miller and Chen approached. Ethan continued to dig, and soon revealed a large metal plate, heavy and rusted, with a thick handle on one side. It looked like a hatch of some kind, camouflaged under the snow. "A ventilation shaft?" Chen murmured, examining it. "Or perhaps a secondary access door to the mining complex." Ethan felt a chill. The tracker pointed to the complex. But Shadow had led them to this hidden entrance, a shortcut or perhaps the route the captor had used. The metal plate was frozen and heavy, but with combined effort, Ethan and Miller managed to lift it. A damp, cold smell of earth and rusted metal rose from the dark hole below. A corroded iron ladder descended into the darkness. Shadow whimpered, sniffing the air coming from the shaft, and then turned to Ethan, his eyes fixed, an undeniable urgency in his gaze. "The girl's scent is down there," Ethan said, his voice low and firm, mixed with something stronger now, something chemical. The red light of the tracker they had found still pulsed in his hand. Its signal now seemed more like an invitation than a clue. They were on the threshold, about to plunge into the mountain's depths, into a place where the organization's darkness and secrets deepened. The hunt was about to turn into an underground rescue, and time was running out with every passing second. The damp, frigid air rising from the dark hole enveloped Ethan. A smell of earth, rusted metal, and something else, something chemical and pungent that scratched at his throat. Shadow, with an anxious whimper, was already pushing towards the edge, his amber eyes fixed on the darkness. There was no time to hesitate. "I'll go first," Ethan declared, tying Shadow's sled rope to his belt and holding the canine's leash. The dog, sensing the urgency, waited patiently as Ethan positioned himself. He flicked on the flashlight mounted on his helmet, the beam cutting through the darkness and revealing the corroded steps of the iron ladder descending into the abyss. The metal groaned under his weight as he began the descent, each step echoing in the shaft. Miller and Chen followed closely, their own flashlights creating a ballet of lights in the dust and moisture suspended in the air. The howling wind of the blizzard, which had been a constant presence, was now just a distant whisper above them, muffled by rock and earth. The only audible sound was the creak of metal, the slow drip of water somewhere, and the team's heavy breathing. The ladder seemed endless. Ethan's arms began to burn with the effort, but determination propelled him. Shadow descended with surprising agility, his paws firm on the steps, his nose incessantly sniffing the heavy air. The chemical smell Ethan had noticed on the surface was now stronger, mixed with a metallic aroma and a faint hint of something burnt, like oil or fuel. Finally, Ethan's feet touched the packed dirt floor. His flashlight's beam revealed a narrow, irregular tunnel, its walls damp and dark rock. The ceiling was low, forcing him to stoop. The air here was even colder, and an oppressive silence hung, broken only by the distant dripping and the team's breathing. "We're in," Miller murmured, his voice low, echoing strangely. Shadow didn't wait. He tugged on the rope, a low, continuous growl vibrating in his chest. The girl's scent, once faint and mixed with snow, was now stronger, more concentrated, and the chemical smell was intrinsically linked to it. There was something else, however, a new element that made Shadow's fur bristle, an almost imperceptible vibration, an electrical hum that seemed to come from the very walls of the mountain. They moved slowly through the tunnel, their boots kicking up clouds of fine, damp dust. The flashlights revealed old, faded graffiti on the walls, traces of miners from a distant past, but also something more recent. Thin tire marks in the dust, like those of a small vehicle or minecart. "Look at this," Chen whispered, pointing to the ground. "Fresh marks, and they're not ours." Ethan knelt, running his hand over the marks. They were sharp, clear grooves in the layer of dust. The dust itself seemed to have been recently disturbed in several places. He also noticed small grease stains and some synthetic fibers caught in the cracks of the floor, similar to those found in the cabin. Dr. Sharma would be interested. A faint sound, a muffled metallic clank, reverberated through the tunnel ahead. It wasn't the dripping water, it was distinct, human, industrial. Shadow stopped abruptly, ears perked, the growl in his throat deepening. He turned his head towards a side tunnel, darker and seemingly narrower than the main one. The girl's scent was strong there, mixed with the chemical aroma and the electrical hum that was now more noticeable. "She's around here," Ethan said, his voice tense, pointing to the side tunnel. His heart pounded in his chest. They were close, too close perhaps. As they prepared to enter the side tunnel, a faint, steady glint caught Ethan's attention. On the ground, near the entrance, was a small object. He bent down, picking it up. It was a spent brass bullet casing with the firing pin marked. It wasn't a common hunting caliber. It was something heavier, more militarized. The metallic clank repeated. this time closer, followed by a distant, unintelligible murmur that seemed to come from the tunnel where Shadow was guiding them. Adrenaline pulsed through Ethan's veins. This wasn't just an abandoned mining complex. It was an active base of operations, and they had just stumbled into the wolves' lair. The hunt was over. The rescue was about to begin, and the darkness promised an imminent confrontation. The metallic clank and the distant, unintelligible murmur coming from the side tunnel sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. The spent bullet casing in his gloved hand felt icy, a grim reminder of the dangerous line they were crossing. This wasn't just an abandoned mine. It was a fortress, a den. "Careful," Ethan whispered, his voice tense, pointing to the side tunnel. "Armed!" Miller and Chen nodded, their expressions hardened by determination. Shadow, with a low, continuous growl, was already pushing towards the entrance of the passage, his muscles tense and ready. The girl's scent was undeniable there, mixed with the chemical aroma and the electrical hum that was now a constant murmur, almost a pulsation coming from the depths of the rock. Ethan led the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The side tunnel was even narrower and more irregular than the main one, its walls damp and slippery. The ceiling dropped dangerously in some places, forcing them to stoop even lower. With each step, the sound of their boots on the packed earth seemed deafening in the oppressive silence. The air grew denser, saturated with the metallic smell and the pungent aroma of chemicals, like solvents or reagents, that scratched at his throat. The electrical hum intensified, turning into a subtle hiss, like exposed wires or distant machinery in operation. Shadow stopped suddenly, ears perked, body tense, sniffing the air with urgency. His amber eyes gleamed in the darkness, fixed on something further ahead. "What is it, boy?" Ethan whispered, raising his weapon and pointing the flashlight. The beam of light revealed a sharp bend in the tunnel. As Ethan rounded the corner, his eyes widened. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, but it wasn't a natural chamber. It was an installation. Large, rusted ventilation ducts ran along the ceiling, and thick electrical cables snaked across the walls, disappearing into makeshift control panels. The electrical hiss was now an audible, constant hum, coming from a series of heavy machines covered by dirty tarps, but clearly operational. The chemical smell was overwhelming, and the air was heavy with the heat generated by something that was running. In the center of the chamber, there was a sturdy metal table covered with tools and complex electronic equipment. An old computer monitor flickered with lines of code. But what caught Ethan's attention most was the cage. It was a metal structure, large enough for one person, with a door locked by a heavy padlock. Inside, there were crumpled blankets and an untouched plate of food. The sight made Ethan's blood run cold. No one was there now, but the evidence of captivity was irrefutable. Shadow let out a sharp bark, a sound of frustration and anger, and began to scratch furiously at the floor near the cage. He wasn't sniffing the cage itself, but the floor beside it. Ethan knelt, following Shadow's instinct. The dust on the floor was disturbed there, and a subtle fissure was visible in the rock, barely disguised. He ran his hand over it, feeling a current of cold air rising. "There's another passage here," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "An exit or an entrance to another section." Miller approached, examining the fissure. "It's well hidden. They didn't want this found." Suddenly, a metallic, dragging sound echoed from a tunnel opposite the one they had entered. It was louder this time, more distinct, as if something heavy was being moved. And then a deep, impatient male voice resonated, though the words were still unintelligible. The conversation was approaching. "They're coming back," Chen whispered, his hand already on his weapon. Adrenaline flooded Ethan. They were inside the base of operations, and the captors were just a few feet away. The girl wasn't in the cage, but Shadow's trail indicated she had been moved, perhaps through that hidden passage. "Shadow, quiet," Ethan ordered softly but firmly. The canine obeyed, but his muscles trembled with tension. Ethan looked at the hidden passage, then at the tunnel from which the voices came. Confrontation was imminent. They had to act, and fast. The girl's life depended on it. The chemical smell, the electrical hum, and the sound of voices blended into a terrifying crescendo. They were cornered, but they were also closer than ever. The air vibrated with a sinister symphony of chemical fumes, electrical hum, and approaching voices. Ethan Thorne's mind raced, processing options in a split second. The girl wasn't in the cage. Shadow's frantic scratching on the floor beside it was the key. A direct confrontation with an unknown number of enemies in a confined space was an unacceptable risk, especially when the primary objective was the victim's rescue. "Miller, Chen, cover me! Shadow, this way!" Ethan commanded, his voice a low growl barely audible above the rising din. He knelt, ignoring the cold, damp earth, and began a frantic search along the subtle fissure Shadow had indicated. The rock seemed solid, but there had to be a mechanism. His gloved fingers traced the outline, finding a small, almost invisible indentation. He pressed it. A soft click echoed, surprisingly loud in the tense silence. A section of the rock wall, no larger than a cupboard door, yielded inward with a groan of rusted hinges, revealing a narrow, pitch-black shaft. A gust of colder, stagnant air burst out, carrying a faint, sweet smell. Not chemical, but something organic, almost floral, mixed with the ever-present metallic tang. "Quick!" Ethan urged, already squeezing through the opening. Shadow, a blur of dark fur, was right behind him, his nose twitching, his low growl now a focused hum. The passage was tight, a claustrophobic descent into absolute darkness. Ethan's flashlight beam cut through the black, revealing raw rock walls, glistening with moisture. The floor sloped abruptly, a treacherous mix of loose gravel and slippery mud. Miller and Chen followed, their movements swift and silent. The voices from the main chamber quickly faded, replaced by the harsh sound of their own boots on loose rock and the heavy thud of their breathing. The electrical hum was less pronounced here, but the new sweet smell intensified, mingling with the familiar chemical odor. Shadow moved with an urgency that communicated more than words. He was closer. The passage snaked downward for what felt like an eternity, the air growing heavier, colder. Ethan's muscles screamed with the effort of the descent, but the thought of the girl, so close yet still out of reach, fueled his determination. Suddenly, the tunnel widened slightly and the incline lessened. Shadow stopped abruptly, his body rigid, ears twitching. A faint, rhythmic dripping echoed from somewhere ahead, accompanied by a soft, almost imperceptible hiss. Ethan raised his weapon, his flashlight sweeping the area. The tunnel opened into another, slightly larger cavern. This one was different. The walls were not raw rock, but lined with rustic, dark insulation panels. The air was thick with the sweet floral smell, now overwhelming, layering over the chemical one. It was almost cloying, like cheap perfume trying to mask something foul. His light caught something on the ground, a small, worn rag doll, its button eyes staring into the void in the darkness. Beside it, a child's shoe, small and scuffed, lay abandoned. Ethan's breath hitched. These were fresh, undeniable signs. The girl had been here, very recently. Shadow let out a soft whimper, nudging the doll with his nose, then moved forward, his tail wagging subtly, a sign of intense focus rather than playfulness. He pulled Ethan towards a section of the insulated wall. The hiss was stronger there, and a faint, sharp whistle joined it. "What do we have here, boy?" Ethan whispered, his voice almost inaudible. He knelt, examining the wall. The insulation panels were loosely fitted, and behind one of them he could see a faint glow pulsing rhythmically. It was a light, and it wasn't natural. He carefully removed the panel. The sight that greeted him sent a chill colder than the mountain air through his bones. Beyond the panel, there was a small, crudely built room, illuminated by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Wires snaked across the floor, connecting to a series of large cylindrical tanks that hissed softly. The sweet, floral smell was overwhelming there, emanating from the tanks. And then he saw her. Huddled in a corner, nestled under a thin, dirty blanket, was a small figure. Her hair was matted, her face pale and smudged with dirt. She was incredibly thin, her small body trembling, but she was alive. "It's her," Chen whispered, a mix of relief and horror in his voice. Shadow let out a soft, joyful bark, a sound that was immediately cut short by Ethan's urgent, "Quiet!" But it was too late. The bark had echoed, bouncing off the cavern walls. From somewhere deeper within the complex, a sudden metallic thump erupted, followed by a shouted command, muffled but distinct. The sound of heavy footsteps, now closer, began to reverberate through the rock. They had been discovered. The rescue was no longer a stealth operation. It was now a race against time, with the girl finally within reach and their pursuers closing in. The metallic thump and the shouted command reverberated, cutting through the already heavy air. There was no more time for whispers or stealthy movements. The girl's rescue, which had been a delicate operation in the shadows, transformed into a desperate race against time. "Miller, Chen, barrier, now!" Ethan roared, his voice hoarse with urgency, as he lunged into the small room. Shadow, with a low, menacing growl, positioned himself beside Ethan, his eyes fixed on the figure huddled in the corner. The girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old, slowly raised her head, her wide, terror-filled eyes staring at Ethan. A dry sob escaped her throat, and she shrank back even further, like a small, cornered animal. The sweet, cloying smell of the tanks was overwhelming there, and Ethan noticed a thin tube coming from one of the cylinders and disappearing under the child's blanket. His stomach churned. Those tanks weren't just to mask the smell, they were doing something. "It's okay, sweetie," Ethan said, his voice trying to sound calm and reassuring, despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. He approached slowly, extending an open hand. "We're from the FBI. We've come to get you out of here." The girl didn't respond, just trembled. Her eyes, however, darted to Shadow for an instant, a spark of curiosity mixed with fear. Shadow, sensing the change, let out a soft, comforting whimper, gently nudging his nose against the blanket. Meanwhile, Miller and Chen acted with military precision. Miller positioned himself at the tunnel entrance, his weapon pointed towards the approaching sounds, while Chen stood at the panel opening, providing cover and observing the room. The hiss of the tanks and the faint whistle of the tube mingled with the growing sound of heavy footsteps. "They're in the main tunnel, Ethan," Miller shouted, his voice tense. "2, maybe 3, I can't see clearly." Ethan knelt beside the girl, ignoring the dirt and the smell. His skilled fingers found the thin tube which was taped to her arm. It was a makeshift IV. The liquid in the tanks was clear, but the smell was unmistakable. A mixture of glucose and something else, something he couldn't identify, but which filled him with a terrible premonition. "We need to get her out of here now," Ethan ordered, his voice firm. He gently pulled the tube, which detached with a soft plop. The girl flinched but didn't protest. "Can you walk, little one?" She nodded weakly, her eyes still fixed on him. "Shadow, protect her," Ethan said to the K9, who positioned himself between the girl and the room's entrance, his body tense and ready. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by male voices that were now discernible, though the words were still an angry murmur. A loud metallic clang resonated, as if a heavy door had been opened or pushed. "Ethan, they're turning the corner," Chen warned, his voice tense. There was no time for explanations. Ethan picked up the girl, surprised at how light she was. She was a fragile burden, almost weightless. He held her tightly, feeling her small arms cling to him with surprising strength. "Miller, Chen, fall back to the tunnel. We'll try the passage back to the cabin," Ethan commanded, his mind already tracing the escape route. It was risky, but the tunnel was narrow, and they had the advantage of the terrain. The moment Miller began to retreat, a furious shout erupted from the main tunnel. A burly man, with a sparse beard and bloodshot eyes, emerged in the opening, wielding a long-barreled weapon. Behind him, two more figures materialized. "Stop, you bastards!" the man growled, his voice echoing through the cavern. Miller fired a warning shot that ricocheted off the rock, producing a sharp crack. The man recoiled momentarily, but his accomplices were already advancing. "Run!" Ethan shouted. Turning and squeezing through the insulation panel opening, the girl nestled in his arms. Shadow followed closely, his deep growl filling the space. Gunshots began to crackle. The sound of bullets ricocheting off the rock walls filled the air, mixed with the captor's shouts and Shadow's furious growl. The rescue had turned into a desperate escape, a race for life amidst the sweet, sickly smell that seemed to permeate everything. Ethan turned, the girl nestled against his chest, and squeezed back through the narrow opening in the insulation panel. The sweet, suffocating smell of the tanks still enveloped him, now mixed with the acrid odor of gunpowder and the damp smell of rock. Shadow, a blur of dark fur and tense muscles, slid in right behind him, his body acting as a living shield between Ethan and the approaching aggressors. The crack of bullets ricocheting off the rock intensified, accompanied by furious shouts from the captors and Shadow's low, continuous growl. Miller and Chen, with brutal synchronicity, fired a volley of suppressive shots, forcing the men to momentarily retreat. "Go! I'll cover the rear!" Miller shouted, his voice tense as Chen followed Ethan, keeping his weapon pointed backward. The girl, whom Ethan still held tightly, let out a small whimper, her thin arms clutching him tighter. Her eyes, previously wide with terror, were now closed, her pale face hidden in his shoulder. She was so light, so fragile, and Ethan felt a wave of protective fury. The tunnel back was a steep, slippery descent, even more treacherous now that he carried a precious burden. His feet sought purchase on the loose gravel and mud, while his flashlight beam danced in the darkness, revealing the damp rock walls. The sound of the pursuit echoed behind them, a chorus of heavy footsteps and furious voices. "They're coming fast!" Chen warned, his voice breathless. A sharp whiz cut through the air, and a bullet ricocheted dangerously close to Chen's head, letting out a deafening ping. "Hold on, little one," Ethan whispered to the girl, adjusting her in his arms. Shadow ahead moved with surprising agility, his nose guiding him through the darkness and gunpowder smoke. He stopped suddenly, ears alert, and let out an urgent bark. "What is it, boy?" Ethan asked, his voice muffled by effort and adrenaline. Shadow's bark wasn't an alert for enemies, but a different warning. Ethan's light beam revealed the reason. The passage that had once seemed a direct path now had a collapsed section, a pile of rocks and earth blocking the way. "Damn it!" Ethan cursed. "The tunnel collapsed. We can't go back the same way." "It must have triggered a trap or a controlled collapse," Chen speculated, his voice tense. "It was meant to trap us here." The sound of the pursuers was dangerously close. Miller, who was at the rear, fired a few more shots, but the advantage of the terrain was diminishing. "Ethan, we don't have much time. They're almost at the room entrance," he shouted. Shadow, ignoring the collapse, began to sniff frantically at a small fissure in the rock wall next to the blockage, letting out low, insistent whimpers. It was almost imperceptible, an opening smaller than the one they had used to enter the complex. "Another passage?" Ethan pondered, time running out. He approached, the girl still in his arms, and tried to peer through the fissure. The air coming from there was even colder, and the sweet floral smell was less intense, replaced by an odor of damp earth and something metallic, different from the chemical smell coming from the tanks. "We have no choice," Ethan decided. "Miller, Chen, cover me." I'll try this passage. It's tight, but it should lead us somewhere. With the girl still pressed against him, Ethan began to squeeze through the fissure, the rough rock scratching his jacket. It was an incredibly narrow passage, barely allowing him to pass sideways. The girl let out a small gasp, but remained silent, her trust placed entirely in Ethan. Shadow wriggled through with surprising ease, sliding through the opening just ahead. Miller and Chen took turns, firing covering shots as Ethan and Shadow advanced. The sound of a muffled explosion reverberated, shaking the rock around them. "Concussion grenade!" Miller shouted, his voice muffled. "They're trying to stun us!" The new passage was an even steeper and more claustrophobic descent, plunging into a darkness that Ethan's flashlight could barely penetrate. The floor was packed earth and loose rocks, and the air was heavy and damp. The metallic smell intensified, a smell of raw ore, and the occasional ping of water dripping from stalactites became the only sound, muffling the echoes of the pursuit. Ethan felt the girl's body relax a little in his arms, perhaps from exhaustion, perhaps from the feeling of being a little further from the gunshots and shouts. He knew the danger was still present, but the distance was increasing. Suddenly, the passage opened into a larger, but still subterranean chamber. Ethan's flashlight revealed a surprising scene. It was not a natural cave. There were rusted tracks on the ground, disappearing into the darkness in both directions. The walls were raw rock, but with clear marks of manual excavation. It was an old mine. In the center of the chamber, a rotting wooden structure, which appeared to be an abandoned control post, lay in ruins, and more importantly, there was a fork. Two mine tunnels extended away, one to the left, the other to the right, both enveloped in almost total darkness. The metallic smell was strong here, mixed with mold and earth. "A mine!" Chen gasped, catching up to Ethan Miller close behind. They used an abandoned mine as part of the complex. Shadow, without hesitation, turned towards the right tunnel, letting out a soft, urgent whimper, his tail wagging with focused intensity. His eyes gleamed in the darkness, fixed on the path ahead. "He found an exit," Ethan murmured, a new wave of hope mixed with exhaustion. Or at least, a way out, to the right. The sounds of the pursuit seemed more distant now, muffled by the rock and the complexity of the tunnels. But Ethan knew they couldn't let their guard down. The mine was a labyrinth, and they were far from safe. The girl, with her eyes still closed, seemed to breathe more easily, but her body continued to tremble slightly. They were in a race against time, and the darkness of the mine was both a refuge and a new threat. With each step, Ethan felt the weight of responsibility, the warmth of the small body in his arms, and Shadow's relentless determination guiding them out of that underground hell. Ethan, with the girl nestled in his arms, followed Shadow into the right tunnel. The air there was dense and cold, laden with the metallic, damp smell of raw ore and wet earth. The rusted tracks creaked under their feet, a sound that seemed amplified by the oppressive darkness. His flashlight beam danced, revealing an uneven path of loose rocks and dark water puddles, where the constant dripping of water from the rock created a rhythmic ping. "Stay alert," Ethan whispered, his voice low and hoarse. "We don't know what awaits us here." Shadow advanced with silent determination, his body low and tense, his nose guiding him through the subterranean labyrinth. His footsteps were almost inaudible, a contrast to the agent's careful shuffling. The girl in his arms let out a small sigh, her light body still trembling, but now it seemed more a shiver from cold than from terror. Ethan squeezed her tighter, trying to impart some warmth. The tunnel narrowed and widened in places, the raw rock walls occasionally giving way to rotting wooden supports that groaned under the weight of the earth above. A sudden, loud crack of splintering wood echoed, making everyone hold their breath. Miller and Chen immediately raised their weapons, sweeping the darkness with their light beams. "Looks unstable," Chen observed, his voice tense. "We need to be fast." Ethan felt a new tightness in his chest. The mine was a trap in itself, a crumbling labyrinth that could collapse at any moment. The sweet, nauseating smell of the tanks still lingered in his nostrils, a constant reminder of the atrocity they had discovered. Suddenly, Shadow stopped, ears perked, and let out a low, continuous growl. It wasn't the growl of immediate danger, but a warning. Ethan's flashlight beam followed the K9's gaze, revealing an unexpected fork. But this wasn't a simple choice. The left tunnel was blocked by a pile of fresh rubble, a recent collapse that smelled of exposed earth and minerals. The right tunnel, the one Shadow indicated, seemed more open, but led to a steep, dark descent. "Another collapse," Miller murmured, examining the rubble. "They're trying to corner us." Shadow's growl intensified, and he began to pull to the right, scratching the stone floor with his paws. "He's telling us to go right," Ethan said without questioning. His trust in Shadow was absolute. The descent was treacherous, the floor slippery with mud and loose gravel. Ethan had to use one hand to brace himself against the damp walls, while the other held the girl firmly. She, in turn, clung to him with surprising strength for her small body, her face now nestled in his neck. The tunnel deepened, and the temperature dropped even further, the frigid air making their lungs ache. The sound of dripping water became more prominent, and an underground stream, barely visible in the darkness, ran alongside the rusted tracks. A loud splash echoed as Shadow leaped over the water without hesitation. "Ethan, the sounds of pursuit are closer again," Chen warned, his voice tense. "It seems they followed us here or are using alternative routes." The distant boom reverberated through the mine walls, sending small stones falling from the ceiling. It was the unmistakable sound of an explosion, perhaps a grenade or a new collapse provoked by the captors. "They won't give up," Ethan thought, feeling adrenaline pump again. He quickened his pace despite the difficult terrain. The girl let out a small whimper, and he knew she was exhausted. But there was no time to stop. Shadow stopped again, this time with a sharp, urgent bark. Ethan's light beam revealed the reason. The tunnel opened into a much larger cavern, a dark abyss where the sound of the stream turned into a distant roar. A crumbling wooden bridge, with several planks missing, stretched precariously over the void. Below, the darkness was total, and the sound of water was deafening. "A bridge," Miller murmured, his voice filled with apprehension. "I don't know if it'll hold our weight." Shadow, ignoring the fragility of the structure, began to cross the bridge, his paws testing each plank before advancing. He seemed to have a clear objective, a route only he could discern. The girl raised her head, her eyes finally opening, and looked at the bridge with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "We have to go," Ethan decided, time running out. "Miller, Chen, one at a time. I'll go first with the girl. Shadow, guide us." The wood creaked and groaned under the weight of Ethan and the girl. Each step was an act of faith, the void below them a promise of a fall. The icy wind, blowing from the abyss, carried the smell of dampness and stone, and the roar of the water intensified, swallowing the distant sounds of pursuit. The girl pressed herself even tighter, her small body trembling. Ethan knew they were at a critical point. Crossing the bridge was their only chance to escape, but also the most dangerous. Their fate hung over an abyss. Ethan felt the agonizing groan of the wood beneath his feet, each old plank protesting against the weight. The void below them seemed to suck the air, and the roar of the water, now a continuous thunder, rose from the abyss. The girl clung to him with desperate strength, her face buried in his shoulder, her small body trembling. Shadow ahead moved with surprising agility, his paws testing each piece of wood, a beacon of determination in the darkness. "Careful, one at a time," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the water. "Miller, Chen, wait for my order." The icy wind blowing from the bottom of the abyss lashed their faces, bringing with it the damp smell of stone and the promise of a fatal fall. Ethan felt the bridge sway. A plank under his left foot gave way with a dry snap, and he quickly leaned to the right, seeking support. The girl's heart beat like a hummingbird in his chest. From the other side of the abyss, a dark shadow moved. A beam of light danced in the darkness, followed by a sharp crack. A shot. The bullet ricocheted off the rock near the entrance of the tunnel they had come from. "They're shooting!" Miller shouted, his voice tense. "They saw us!" "Keep going," Ethan ordered, ignoring the imminent danger of the gunshots. The focus now was the bridge. Shadow let out a short, urgent bark, urging them forward. Ethan quickened his pace as much as he could, balancing the girl's weight and the bridge's instability. The wood creaked and groaned, seemingly about to fall apart at any moment. He could feel the vibrations of the shots ricocheting off the cavern walls. Finally, with a last effort, Ethan stepped onto solid ground on the other side. The girl let out a shaky sigh, but didn't open her eyes. Shadow turned, looking back, his low, continuous growl now directed at the shooters. "Miller, Chen, come on!" Ethan shouted. "Quick!" Miller was next, running crouched over the bridge. More shots echoed, and bullets whizzed dangerously close to him. A plank shattered under his feet, and he stumbled, but regained his balance with a muffled cry. Chen followed closely, covering him with his weapon, firing a few shots back into the darkness. The moment Chen stepped onto solid ground, a deafening roar reverberated through the cavern. The bridge, already precarious, completely gave way in the middle, plummeting into the abyss with a roar of wood and rock. The sound of the water below intensified for an instant, swallowing the remains of the structure. "The bridge is gone!" Miller gasped, looking into the void. "We're trapped here." "Not trapped," Ethan corrected, turning to the tunnel Shadow was already sniffing. "Just one less route for them to follow us. Good job, Shadow." The K9 wagged his tail once, a sign of satisfaction, and then refocused. The tunnel ahead was narrow, but seemed more stable, with solid rock walls. The smell of raw ore and wet earth was still present, but there was a fresh air current, different from the stagnant air of the mine. "I feel fresh air," Chen observed, taking a deep breath. "We're close to the surface, I think." Ethan felt a pang of hope. The girl in his arms relaxed a little, her body still tense, but less rigid. He could feel the warmth of her breath on his neck. Shadow, with a new sense of urgency, began to run through the tunnel. Ethan followed him, his footsteps echoing on the rock. The tunnel began to slope upward, and the darkness began to recede, revealing a faint, bluish glow ahead. The smell of pine and fresh snow invaded their nostrils, mixing with the smell of the mine. A distant sound of howling wind replaced the dripping water and the roar of the abyss. "It's an exit!" Miller exclaimed, his voice filled with relief. They emerged into a snow-covered landscape, a clearing among tall, dense pine trees. The snowstorm still battered the mountains, but here, protected by the trees, the wind was less fierce. The faint twilight, filtered by heavy clouds, gave the scene a bluish, ethereal tone. Ethan breathed deeply the frigid air, the oxygen burning his lungs. He looked at the girl in his arms. She slowly opened her eyes, revealing a pale blue, and watched the falling snow with an expression of surprise and weariness. Shadow let out a joyful bark, running in circles in the snow, his tail wagging furiously. He had accomplished his mission. "We're out," Ethan murmured, feeling the weight of exhaustion and overwhelming relief. "We're out, kid." But the sense of security was tenuous. They were in the middle of nowhere, on a snow-covered mountain, and their pursuers were still down in the mine. The escape was only the first step. "We need evacuation," Chen said, already grabbing his radio. "We're on the surface, in a dense pine forest area, near the mine entrance. The internal bridge is destroyed, but they might have other exits." Ethan looked at the girl, who was now watching the snow fall with an almost childlike curiosity. He knew the worst was over for her, but the journey wasn't over for them yet. The criminal network was still at large, and the mountain, while offering an escape route, was also a vast and dangerous labyrinth. The real battle to dismantle their operation was just beginning. Chen's voice, though tense, carried a note of urgency through the radio, each word a struggle against the wind's howl. "We're on the surface, in a dense pine forest area near the mine entrance. The internal bridge is destroyed, but they might have other exits." Ethan, still holding the girl, felt the icy air prick his exposed skin. The smell of pine and snow was invigorating, but the vastness of the mountain, now that they were free from the tunnel, felt overwhelming. The girl, with her pale blue eyes, watched the snowflakes swirl and land on her small hands. A silent wonder that broke Ethan's heart. Miller approached, his breath forming white clouds in the air. "They won't stay put down there. If there's an exit, they'll find it. Or maybe they already have. We need to move." Shadow, who moments before had been wagging his tail in the snow, stopped abruptly. His ears twitched, picking up sounds human ears couldn't discern. A low, guttural growl escaped his throat, and his fur bristled again. He turned his head north, towards the densest part of the forest, where the trees stood like dark sentinels against the grey sky. "What is it, boy?" Ethan asked, his voice low and tense. Shadow's growl intensified. It wasn't the sound of a wild animal, but of a human threat. Ethan followed the canine's gaze, scanning the darkness between the pines. A dry snap like a branch breaking under weight echoed in the forest's stillness. It wasn't the wind. "They're here," Miller whispered, drawing his weapon, or at least one of them. Chen, still trying to establish clear radio communication, hissed, "Signal's weak, Ethan. Can't get a stable connection. The mountain's blocking it." The girl, sensing the shift in tension, pressed herself against Ethan again, her eyes wide with fear. The wind's howl seemed to increase, as if the mountain itself was warning them. "We can't stay put," Ethan decided. "Shadow, lead the way. Find an escape route. Miller, Chen, cover our rear." Shadow, without hesitation, plunged into the dense forest, his agile body moving between the snow-covered trunks. Ethan followed, the girl in his arms, each step in the deep snow an effort. The terrain was treacherous, roots hidden under the snow, slippery rocks. The crunch of snow under their boots was the only sound besides the wind and Shadow's growl. The icy air burned in his lungs with each exhalation. Drops of melting snow ran down Ethan's hood, and the cold began to seep into his clothes. He could feel the girls trembling against his chest, not just from fear, but from cold. They needed to find shelter, and fast. Suddenly, Shadow stopped, his eyes, gleaming in the gloom, fixed on something ahead. A short, urgent bark escaped his throat. Ethan raised his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. Ahead of them, a narrow fissure in the rock opened, almost invisible under the accumulated snow. It looked like a small cave or an alcove, perhaps large enough to shelter them from the wind and snow. "Shelter," Ethan murmured, feeling a flicker of hope. "Let's go." A dry, sharp shot cut through the air from behind them. The bullet ricocheted off a nearby tree with a loud crack, sending splinters of wood flying. "They found us!" Miller shouted. "To the cave!" Ethan ordered, running towards the fissure. The girl let out a muffled cry, and he held her tighter. Shadow was already inside the alcove, turning to face the forest, a furious growl vibrating in his chest. Miller and Chen positioned themselves at the fissure's entrance. Their weapons pointed into the forest's darkness. More shots echoed, and bullets whizzed past them, scraping against the rock. "We're cornered here!" Chen exclaimed, firing back. "Not for long," Ethan replied, his eyes scanning the interior of the small cave. It was tight, but offered temporary protection. The smell of damp earth and moss was strong. He could feel the faint warmth the rock offered, a momentary relief from the biting cold. The girl, now calmer, looked at the cave wall. Her small fingers touched a protrusion in the rock, and she pointed upward to a dark, narrow opening in the cave ceiling, almost imperceptible. A faint hiss of wind came from there. Ethan followed her gaze. A natural chimney, a passage to somewhere else. The girl's intuition, or perhaps just her childish curiosity, had revealed something his trained eyes had missed. "Shadow," Ethan said, pointing to the opening. The canine sniffed the air, then looked at the passage, his eyes gleaming with new determination. He let out a short bark, almost an invitation. The mountain, which had once seemed an endless labyrinth, perhaps held one more secret. An unexpected escape route, or an even deeper trap. The race against time and against their pursuers was far from over. The small opening in the ceiling, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, offered a tenuous, desperate hope. Ethan looked at the girl, who still pointed, her childlike eyes fixed on the darkness above. The faint hiss of wind coming from there was both an invitation and a warning. "Shadow, check it out," Ethan ordered, pointing again. The K9, with a short, impatient bark, leaped onto the rock. His paws found purchase on the small ledges, and he began to climb with surprising agility, his slender body quickly disappearing into the fissure. Fragments of earth and small stones fell to the cave floor, accompanied by the scrape of his claws. Outside, the gunshots continued, closer now, bullets cracking against the rock near the entrance. Miller and Chen fired back, their voices tense. "They're trying to flank us!" Chen shouted, a return shot echoing in the cave. "We won't last long here, Ethan." "Shadow?" Ethan called, his voice resonating in the stone. A muffled but firm bark came from above. The sound seemed more distant, as if the dog had already moved on. It was an escape route. "Okay, we're going up," Ethan decided, turning to Miller and Chen. "Miller, you first. I'll go with the girl. Chen, cover our climb and come last." Miller nodded, tension etched on his face. He gripped the rock ledges, his muscular body straining to pull himself up. The scrape of his boots on the stone and the gasp of his effort filled the air as he squeezed through the opening. A moment later, a murmur of relief came from above. "It's a tunnel, Ethan. Narrow, but it seems safe." Ethan held the girl tightly. "All right, kid, it's going to be a bit tight, but we're getting out of here." He instructed her to hold his neck tightly, and she did, her small arms trembling. With his flashlight clipped to his vest and his weapon in hand, he began to climb, using one hand for support and the other to protect the girl. The rock was cold and damp against his exposed skin. The smell of earth and moss was even more intense inside. The space was claustrophobic, the absolute darkness swallowing his flashlight's beam with each turn. He could hear the rustle of his clothes and the scrape of his body against the rock. The girl let out small whimpers of discomfort, but didn't cry. She was incredibly resilient. Finally, he felt Miller's hand pulling him. With a last effort, Ethan dragged himself out of the fissure, the girl still in his arms. They were in a much wider tunnel, though still dark and winding. Shadow was ahead, sniffing the air, his tail wagging slowly. The drip of water echoed somewhere further ahead. Chen emerged shortly after, panting, his weapon still pointed at the opening they had come from. "They're entering the cave now," he said, his voice hoarse. "We don't have much time." Ethan shone his flashlight brighter, revealing a raw rock tunnel with veins of ore gleaming faintly. The air here was colder, and a damp breeze blew from further down. "Shadow, lead the way," Ethan ordered. "Find an exit." The K9 obeyed, his steps light and quick. The tunnel began to slope downward, and the murmur of water grew louder, turning into a distant roar. The smell of dampness and mold intensified, mixing with a faint metallic odor. "Looks like we're going deeper into the mountain again," Miller observed, concern in his voice. "I hope this isn't a trap." Ethan felt a shiver. The mountain was a labyrinth, and they were playing a dangerous game. But there was no turning back. The sounds of gunshots and the shouts of their pursuers could still be heard, muffled but present, coming from the opening they had left. The girl, who had relaxed for a moment, now cringed again, her eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. A distant rumble, a sound that was neither water nor wind, echoed through the tunnel. It was a mechanical sound, a low, constant hum, almost imperceptible. Shadow stopped abruptly, his fur bristling, a deep growl escaping his throat. He wasn't growling at the mechanical sound, but at something else. His eyes were fixed on a fissure in the tunnel wall, an almost imperceptible opening covered by some loose rocks. From there came a different smell, a smell Ethan recognized with a chill, the smell of ozone and burning, the smell of electronics and chemicals. "What is it, boy?" Ethan whispered, feeling a knot in his stomach. The mechanical hum seemed to come from there. The mountain was not just a natural labyrinth, it was also a hiding place for something more sinister. The criminal network was not just using the caves for captivity, but for some other operation, something that needed electricity and machines. The true extent of their operation was about to be revealed. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. The smell of ozone and burning, the mechanical hum. It was the signature of something industrial, something that didn't belong in the heart of an untouched mountain. It wasn't just a hiding place for victims, it was an operations center. "Miller Chen, stay alert," Ethan whispered, his voice grave. Shadow found something big. The K9 scratched at the loose rocks covering the fissure, and Ethan, with the girl still in his arms, approached. He used the toe of his boot to push the stones aside, revealing a narrow but stable opening. His flashlight's beam penetrated the darkness, revealing a concrete passage, smooth and artificial, that contrasted sharply with the raw rock of the tunnel. The hum was louder now, a sound of machines operating somewhere deep. "It's an installation," Miller murmured, his eyes wide. "They built this here." The girl, curious despite her fear, stretched out a finger to touch the cold concrete. Ethan felt his heart quicken, the hope that they would find the entire criminal network and perhaps other victims ignited. "We're going in," he decided without hesitation. "Shadow, lead the way." But slowly. Shadow slipped through the opening, his paws making almost no sound on the concrete floor. Ethan followed, the girl in his arms, feeling the cold, conditioned air of the facility. The smell of ozone was strong, and there was a faint chemical, almost metallic, odor. The concrete tunnel snaked downward, lit by weak fluorescent lights that flickered sporadically, revealing stained walls and old equipment. The hum of machines echoed, adding an oppressive feel to the environment. They advanced cautiously, each step reverberating in the artificial silence of the place. With each turn, the tension increased. Ethan could feel the girl trembling slightly against his chest, but she remained silent, watching with wide eyes. Miller and Chen kept their weapons ready, covering the rear, their faces tense under the flickering light. Suddenly, Shadow stopped. His fur bristled, and a low, continuous growl escaped his throat. He was facing a heavy metal door with a digital control panel beside it. The door was ajar, and a stronger light escaped from the crack, along with muffled voices. "It's here," Ethan whispered, pointing to the door. He signaled to Miller and Chen, "Get ready." With a swift, silent movement, Shadow pushed the door. A low metallic creak resonated as it swung open completely, revealing a cavernous control room. Old computers with green screens flickered on metal tables, and tangled wires ran across the floor and walls. The hum of machines was deafening inside, mingling with the constant click of keyboards and the hiss of some equipment. In the center of the room, a middle-aged man, with thinning gray hair and thick-rimmed glasses, sat in front of a dozen monitors, typing furiously. He didn't immediately notice their entry. Beside him, Another man, younger and burly, stood, watching the monitors with a grim expression. "Freeze! FBI!" Ethan shouted, his voice cutting through the noise of the machines. The two men turned abruptly, their eyes wide with surprise. The younger man reached for his waist, where a weapon was holstered. "Don't!" Ethan ordered, raising his own weapon. "Drop the weapon!" The older man, the brains behind the operation, slowly raised his hands, a cynical smile on his lips. "Agent Thorne, what an unpleasant surprise," he said, his voice calm and controlled, despite the situation. "I thought we'd have more time." Where's the girl?" Ethan demanded, ignoring the provocation. "Which one?" the man replied, a wicked glint in his eyes. "We have so many. Such an efficient network, don't you think? The streets are a goldmine of forgotten souls." Shadow advanced with a furious growl, his teeth bared. The younger man, ignoring the warning, pulled his weapon. A deafening bang filled the room as Chen fired first, hitting the criminal's arm. The man's weapon clattered to the floor with a metallic clack. He let out a cry of pain, falling to his knees. Miller quickly immobilized him, handcuffing him. Ethan kept his weapon pointed at the older man, who remained unsettlingly calm. "You're going to take us to her," Ethan said, his voice icy. "Now." The man sighed, an air of resignation. "No need for violence, Agent. I know when I'm defeated. She's in Sector C, Cell 7. There are others too, in different phases of processing." Ethan felt a knot in his stomach. Processing. The true extent of their cruelty was even worse than he imagined. "Shadow, Sector C, Cell 7. Find them!" The K9, with a sharp bark, darted down a side corridor that extended out of the control room. Ethan, with the girl still in his arms, followed, Miller close behind, keeping the older criminal at gunpoint. Chen stayed behind to secure the control room and the injured criminal. The corridor was a series of metal cells, each with a small grated door. The smell of despair and filth was palpable. A child's whimper echoed faintly from one of the cells. Shadow stopped in front of Cell 7, scratching at the door and barking frantically. "Here!" Shadow barked again, his voice full of urgency. Ethan opened the cell with the key the criminal had thrown on the floor. Inside, huddled in a dark corner, was a thin girl, eyes wide, body trembling. It was the girl they had been looking for, and beside her another child, even smaller, slept on a dirty blanket. The girl Ethan was carrying slipped from his arms and ran to the cell, hugging the girl who was huddled. "You're safe now," she whispered, and Ethan felt a lump in his throat. The resilience of children was a miracle. Miller, with an expression of horror, opened the other cells. In each, there were children and teenagers. Some sleeping, others awake, all with the same look of terror and malnutrition. The shocked silence of the rescued was broken only by muffled sobs and the creak of an opening door. "Call for backup," Ethan said to Miller, his voice choked. "We need medics, psychologists, everyone. We found them all." The older man, now handcuffed and sitting on the control room floor, watched the scene with a cold smile. "It's a shame you arrived so early," he said, his voice still calm. "We had such grand plans." Ethan ignored him. He knelt in front of the girl he had rescued first, and she hugged him tightly. Shadow, with a soft bark, rubbed his head against Ethan's leg, his eyes fixed on the rescued children. The mountain, which had once seemed a labyrinth of cold and danger, now revealed itself as the stage of a nightmare, but also of a victory. The distant sound of sirens began to echo faintly through the tunnels, mixing with the hum of machines and murmurs of relief. The snowstorm outside still battered the mountains, but within that underground complex, the winter of fear was finally beginning to melt. The criminal network had been dismantled, its victims rescued. The mission was accomplished. Ethan looked at Shadow, who stood beside him, his tail wagging slowly. The K9's supernatural instinct, which had guided them from the abandoned cabin, had led to the salvation of so many lives, Agent Thorne felt a wave of gratitude and pride for his partner. The mountain had kept its secrets for too long, but with the help of a dog and the determination of a team, light had finally found its way into the darkness. The silence that would follow would no longer be one of despair, but of hope, a new beginning for the souls rescued from the shadows.